Say it with me, class. What's the best Splinter Cell?
Chaos
Blacklist!
Run.
Don't get too excited yet. I'm not so contrarian I'm going to say that's wrong. But in the discussion of Splinter Cell as a series, I feel like Chaos Theory gets all the recognition that it deserves, while the original is often overlooked for its flashier younger brother. While I do think Chaos Theory is a better overall package, I think that Splinter Cell does some aspects of its gameplay better, and wish that some of its mechanics had been held on for longer than they were. I'm not here to argue that this game is better than Chaos Theory. I don't really think that, but there's cool stuff here that goes underappreciated. I have little to no understanding of music theory, but I know the music in these games makes me feel. And I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about the Splinter Cell soundtrack. I personally view it as one of my favorite game soundtracks of all time. The tracks on different levels tell a story about the map you're on, and the way the music is implemented explains the state of the environments as you go. I'll get to that second part in a minute, but let's break down these tracks. There's a bass drum that comes up in almost every track that brings you back to this being Splinter Cell music, regardless of whether you're in Georgia, Myanmar, or the headquarters of the CIA. But don't mistake these motifs for the songs feeling samey, because they absolutely do not. The training music has a feeling of tension in the foreground like most of the tracks, with a marching snare drum in the background reminding you that you're in the US. And when you return to break into the CIA later in the game, the music is more tense and the pace of the foreground ramps up, but it keeps the drums to ground the map and where it is. The game doesn't just use music to set the vibe though. It's also the game's version of a detection meter. In a game like Metal Gear Solid, the game explicitly tells you when you're detected.
Who's that?
Even the Splinter Cell series eventually caved, doing this with Double Agent. But in Splinter Cell, there are 3 tracks minimum for each mission, with one exception. I'll get to that later. First, a normal exploration theme, usually still with tension in the background, but also occasionally with a feeling of calm that's being disturbed by your presence. When a guard is suspicious, the music plays a sting to make you aware of that fact, and ramps up to what the game files call a stress theme.
Who is that?
The tension and tempo is up here, and this is where the golden tracks in this game are, in my opinion. There's also combat music, and certain set pieces have a pretty rad combat theme. Most of the levels in this game happen in Georgia, the country, not the state.
Welcome back to Georgia, Fisher.
When you arrive at the final mission at the Georgian presidential palace, it's the first time you aren't greeted with music at the start of a level. And when you eventually do cause a disturbance, the stress theme is the same one as the one from your very first operation. But this time, there's added vocals to show the heightened stakes. I have so much to say about the music, but I don't know how much you actually care, so I'll stop gushing now. Let's talk about the movement. Splinter Cell is missing some cool features from future games, but there's a lot more creativity with moving around in this game than any of its sequels. Most people probably know about the split jump. It was in every game up to Conviction, but what many don't know is that in this game you can kick off a wall to gain extra height. That's cool and all, but what even fewer know is that you can maintain momentum while doing this move and use it to get to all kinds of cool places. There's a set piece gunfight at the end of Kalina Tech that you can just skip by jumping up to the end of the level. Obviously that's not intended, but there's a surprisingly large amount of places you can get to in interesting ways by using this move. Next up is the Gadget economy. Obviously the game's never got rid of this feature, and while it's definitely not perfect here, there are some choices that I adore going on here. In the early parts of the game, equipment is very limited. Sam's only weapon is his 5.7 pistol. The range is extremely poor, and the weapon requires the player to hold still for a while before it gains any accuracy. And even then, it's only dependable from an extremely close range. Sam can use an optic cable to look under doors, and a lockpick to open locked doors, go figure. His goggles provide night vision but no thermal. In the first few levels, that's all he has access to unless he needs to use the laser microphone to spy on a scripted conversation.
You're a tool. I'm the technology.
He can hit enemies from behind to knock them out, decide to stun them, or grab them to use them as a human shield. Cans can be found in the environment to use as throwable distractions, and bottles can be used the same way, or to knock out enemies from range with a headshot.
What in God's name?
Now the CIA level from earlier, that's where things change. Fisher is sent in without any weaponry, but for the first time in the game, he receives his rifle on sight. The rifle has a grenade launcher that greatly expands the Gadget economy.
Grows the economy.
Benefits everybody. Hurts nobody.
Available for this grenade launcher are a ring airfoil round that stuns enemies with body shots and knocks them out with headshots, a sticky shocker that will non-lethally incapacitate an enemy with any contact or contact with water, a gas grenade that stuns and then knocks out enemies based on distance to the detonation. It kinda sucks because enemies immediately react, and it bounces a lot, making it hard to aim. But it's useful in a fight to throw at a choke point, since enemies will run into it and get stunned or knocked out by the gas. He also gets a sticky camera that can be used to scout out areas, as well as knocking out enemies provided the camera hits them in the head. Critically, these cameras can be picked up after use and used again. And finally, diversion cameras. These cameras don't have access to night or thermal vision, but in return they can be used to make noise or detonated to knock out enemies with gas. If the gas is used, the camera can't be picked up, but they can be picked up otherwise. Something to keep in mind is that all of these tools have a drop-off over range, and as such, to make accurate shots at a distance, the player needs to lob the rounds in by aiming a bit higher than usual. Since the CIA is inside the United States, the rifle's lethal capacity isn't allowed to be used on enemies.
Good Lord, Fisher, have you gone mad?
And this gives good room for the non-lethal options to shine while the player figures them out. This is great, especially since the rifle is extremely powerful. The restriction stops the rifle from outshining the gadgets in this level. The following level is also inside the United States, but it's filled with Russian mercenaries, so mercy is dispensed a little less liberally. This is where the game can go from a stealth action game to a stealth action game. Let's go over what the rifle is capable of. The crosshair is still quite large, but the range is a lot more trustworthy. In addition to this, the weapon can be set to full auto.
That's full auto in buildings, bro.
I'm not full autoing. It's not full auto.
That's not full auto.
This is.
Making it extremely effective at close range. In addition to that, the weapon's scope can be used to make it extremely effective at range. Like, very effective at range.
Show yourself!
The pistol bloom makes it hard to use at 3 feet away. Once the scope is opened on the rifle, if you can account for the sway, you can nail your shot basically at any range every time. And if you hold your breath, that sway goes away too. And when each enemy only costs a bullet, it can become very tempting to just snipe everyone at every range all the time. It's a lot better on controller since there's no aim assist and aiming is a lot more difficult. I don't want to overstate my case here. Fisher is still a squishy stealth game protagonist, even on normal. It's always better not to get caught. One mission later in the game fixes this problem, and it's my favorite level because of that. The information retrieved from the previous mission implicates the Chinese government in the plot of the main villain. Because of this, Fisher is sent to investigate the validity of the information and hopefully prevent war with China. Because of the sensitive nature of the mission, Fisher can't kill any soldiers on sight without starting World War III. The level wastes no time in making that abundantly clear.
To be clear, if you kill anybody, this mission's over. You slip up on this one.
I'll find a fallout shelter and learn some prayers.
This means that like in the CIA level, Sam has access to all of his equipment except using his overpowered rifle and his pea-shooter pistol. The CIA level didn't give Sam access to diversion cameras. This mission does. Let me get to my point on the whole gadget economy thing. Different items are more dependable and therefore valuable. If you need an enemy to go down right now with a generous window for mistakes, you need a sticky shocker. Hit his elbow, hit his toenail, and he is down. This makes the sticky shocker best as an emergency option. Similarly, the stun from an airfoil round can be followed up with a melee attack or a grab, eliminating the need for a headshot or second round to be wasted. Something else to keep in mind is that certain enemies need to be grabbed to progress the level. So if you get caught by them and you don't have an airfoil round, you're basically screwed. If the player is confident in their lobbing abilities, they can launch a camera from the 3-point line and take out an enemy without wasting any resources at all. I think the game had this in mind because the Chinese embassy level gives you a lot of cameras. In a level without the non-lethal restriction, most of this doesn't factor in for the player. A headshot with the rifle is a lot cheaper when you carry 60 rounds and 5 sticky shockers. But in this level, it all comes together. The final level in the palace introduces guards that can only be headshotted in the face, which is pretty cool and makes sticky shockers and airfoil rounds a lot more valuable. But it doesn't make headshots any harder when in combat since they're already looking at you anyway. It definitely helps though, and I wish these enemies were mixed in with normal enemies throughout the game. The story and Sam's kit escalate together at the same time, and that would be a great time to introduce these enemies to match Sam and the stakes of the game. Speaking of which, this game has a great sense of progression that mirrors the story and I love it. In the first mission, Sam is simply investigating the disappearance of a few CIA agents. The trail eventually leads him to a Russian mercenary and then to the Georgian president's office. There, he discovers an ethnic cleansing in Azerbaijan. This leads Sam to an oil rig where he uncovers a mole in the CIA. All of these levels are high stakes, sure, but they're fairly separate from the United States and they're investigatory in nature. Sam is just looking for information, and he's just got a pistol the whole time. Once he's finished on the oil rig, Georgia strikes the US, and it becomes a lot more personal to Sam.
Have a line back to third echelon.
I'm here, Fisher.
What the hell's going on?
Nikolad's just declared war on the U.S.
What?
The Georgians hit our communications, transportation, power grids. We still don't know how extensive the damage is.
My daughter.
I know. I've got people heading over there. This whole country's a mess.
The level following this cutscene is the level where Sam unlocks his rifle, the main gadgets for it, and his goggles. In the level after that, he unlocks grenades, and there's a section of the level where Lambert orders you to kill an entire area full of enemies. It's no over the hedge in terms of writing, but the escalation makes sense in the story and in gameplay, and I think that's pretty neat. I've had like 3 different scripts for videos on Splinter Cell, and I'm glad I was finally able to talk about my favorite game on this channel. I really appreciate you making it this far. Thank you to my channel members, this is what I spent your money on. And as always, subscribe to my fucking YouTube channel.